beer. Yeah, so my name's well, my cartoon name is Polyp. I've been doing cartoons for various sort of campaign and social justice groups for the last 30 years. I've sort of, as well as doing cartoons, I've drifted into doing graphic novels, mostly about sort of forgotten or hidden history. The last of which is Peterloo, you can see on the screen. This is a large pro-democracy rally in Manchester, in my home city, that was attacked by troops in 1819. And it's one of those, a bit like Paine, it's one of those things that changed the course of social, political, and democratic history, but was largely forgotten for 200 years. So yeah, it's kind of like a bit of a specialist thing now that I've got into. And of course, the next one is going to be about Thomas Paine himself. A couple of cartoons just to sort of show where I'm coming from in terms of religion, or is it overlapped by people's faces? So this is from a small self-published book I did called Think, which was a collection of my cartoons, basically about the skeptics movement, or themed around skepticism. Yeah, I'm one of those people who is kind of the left, but I don't agree with this idea of cultural relativism, where we sort of say, oh, you know, it's okay for certain cultures to have quite repressive rules and quite oppressive attitudes. And so this cartoon is basically trying to sort of counter this argument that atheists must give a free pass to certain religions, otherwise we'll get accused of racism. So yeah, I kind of like tried to be controversial in what I do, not just for the sake of being controversial, because I think these things are true. Yeah, this is an appalling abuse of human rights to suggest that women are the ones tempting men and not the other way around, so on and so forth. Here's another one from the same book, where I guess I'm trying to talk about the fact that I understand why people have religious faith. You know, some religious faiths seem to me to be far more progressive than others. For instance, the Quakers, who are going to come up as, in Paine's life story. But of course, once you start believing in these supernatural things, it can very, very easily lead to the trap of dogma. And again, this is a theme that's going to come up in the talk. I think it's true both of faith in religion, but also sometimes political faith, which again is going to be a theme in Paine's life. And here's perhaps one of the most popular cartoons on the subject. Again, I do get a little bit fed up with this idea that we can have one standard for one group of people with a particular ethnicity and a different standard for another. So I just wanted to sort of show that a lot of these fundamentalist belief systems do share a lot of ideas. In fact, they're motivated often by the same kind of bigotry, which I thought was incredibly amusing. There's a real story behind this cartoon, in that it's about 15 years old now, and I have to keep updating it. You'll notice the woman on the left of the screen. She really should be a MAGA supporter, shouldn't she? It should be somebody wearing a MAGA hat. I've got to get around to updating her. But next to her originally was Osama bin Laden, and of course he then died, so I had to replace him. George Bush was in there for a while at one point, and I had to update it and get rid of him. And then I put the Pope in, thinking surely this one will last for a bit, and then he went and resigned, didn't he? So maybe this cartoon's a bit of a kiss of death for the figures that I include in it. Okay, so a biography of Thomas Paine, Tom Paine's Bones. I'll draw your attention to the fact that it says a fantastical visual biography. It's going to be quite strange visually. You'll see in some of the sample images I'm going to show you. But this is my mock-up cover at this stage of the game. And I think of particular interest to this group, I hope, is Paine's relationship with religion. His very, very troubled and nuanced and fascinating relationship with religious faith. And in the light of that statement, I'm going to introduce you to, well, we're almost going to play a game, which is, will the real Thomas Paine please stand up? And that is, we have Tom, the militant atheist. We have Tom, who is regarded as one of the scourges of religion, whose sayings get shared by loads and loads of atheists and loads of hardened militant anti-religious people. So quotes along the lines of all national institutions of churches, whether Jewish, Christian or Turkish, appear to me to be no other than human inventions set up to terrify and enslave mankind and monopolize power and profit. I think that's one that the atheists would absolutely love, that Paine said. Another absolute cracker, which to me you could play a game of, did Tom Paine say it or did Richard Dawkins say it, is those who most believe the Bible are those who know least about it, which I think is such a fantastic modern sounding quote. It's absolutely cracking. When Paine was on form, he was absolutely on form with his pithy statements. And again, a very Dawkins-esque or Hitchens type one is Paine saying, you believe in the Bible from the accident of birth, and the Turks believe in the Quran from the same accident, and yet each calls the other infidel. So yeah, that is one version of Thomas Paine that certain people absolutely adore and recognize. It's the side of Paine, I think, that led Teddy Roosevelt, the American president, not FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, to describe Paine as a filthy little atheist, which I think is one of the biggest, most popular insults that's been thrown at Paine. So yeah, these illustrations from the book, I hope give you some idea of what I'm talking about the fantastical style. I'm not doing a graphic novel biography, which is just, I'm showing you what the camera would see had the camera been there at the time. It's going to be a much more surreal and dreamlike journey through his life, which is why you have him suddenly appearing as Mr. Punch and suddenly appearing as Obama. So yeah, that's part of the visual style of the book. So that's Tom, the scourge of religion. But then we have Tom, the deeply, deeply religious man, yeah? Along the lines of these quotes from him. That which is called natural philosophy, of which astronomy occupies the chief place, is the study of the works of God and is the true theology. So that really clashes with the quotes you heard earlier. It's absolutely fascinating that Paine has these different facets to his personality, which I hope in the process of this talk, I'll manage to resolve in people's minds a little bit. Another one is Paine saying, I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life. This is one of the illustrations that I've used with that quote. It's actually a hallucination that Paine is having when he was in prison, which we'll come to in a bit. And this is a graphic from the period, believe it or not. It reflects Paine's ideas that astronomy is the path to God, astronomy is the path to religious truth. And it's an illustration from a book by a guy called Thomas Wright of Derby, who was one of Paine's contemporaries and is another fascinating working class figure from the period who rose up the ranks and wrote his own astronomy book in which he believed that the universe itself was conscious. I thought this was a very nice way to illustrate those words. And another one from Paine, the religious version of Paine, if you like. It is only by the exercise of reason that man can discover God. And a last one, I have lived an honest and useful life to mankind, and I die in perfect composure and resignation to the will of my creator God. So I presume nobody would sort of think, wow, this is the same guy, you know, this sounds like exactly the same voice. It doesn't. And it's one of the kind of interesting contradictions that I'm going to try and bring out in the course of the book. But we also have Paine, the advocate of the separation of church and state, in which he said very, very clearly, and he, as you know, was involved in in the sort of early days of the American Democratic Revolution, that mingling religion with politics may be disavowed and reprobated by every inhabitant of America. So a fascinating bloke, a fascinating relationship with religion, very nuanced. Sometimes sounds like he's on one side, sometimes it sounds like he's on the other. And that's something I'll go on to explore in a bit. But I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about how the book is written, and a little sort of potted biography of Paine before we go on to talk in detail about his conflicts with religion. And I hope to go to questions as fast as possible, because I'd really like to hear what, if there's any things that I've missed in the talk that people would like to know about or challenge. So the way this book is going to work is a narrative technique that I started in that Peterloo one I showed you, which is called verbatim narration. And by that, I mean, I've taken the actual primary sources, the documents of the era, like people's diaries, court records, songs, poems, biographies, both hostile and friendly, that were all written at the time. Paine had biographies of him written while he was still alive for propaganda purposes, really hateful, negative stories about his youth. And I've managed to stitch all those together into a narrative without any fictional words in it whatsoever. And as I say, this is something that, like developed during the Peterloo book, where you're researching the source material, sort of thinking, right, what am I going to include in this story? And you think, well, why would I make any dialogue up? Why would I create any fictional stuff when reading these raw documents is just so intense, particularly where your theme is one where there's lots and lots of conflict, and when there's lots of different interpretations of the same people and the same political and social events. In Peterloo, there was this massive contradiction between what the protesters said happened on the day and what the authorities said happened on the day. And the same thing is very true of Paine. Simply by allowing all those voices in, the reader is kind of left trying to make up their own mind as to what's true and what isn't, which to me is, partly the nature of history. It's hard to tell who's telling the truth and who is lying. And that became, or that has become, an extremely important theme in Paine's life, because he is not only forgotten, he's not only one of the most forgotten, influential figures in the history of the world, he's also one of the most hated. I mean, he was absolutely vilified in his time. You think social media is something else, and everybody complains about, how terrible it is that all these mistruths are told about people. But you haven't seen anything compared to what happened to Paine and the reaction that he got from both the authorities and from the church, again, which again we'll come on to. So yeah, you've got this thing going on in these books, particularly with Paine, where the words are absolutely authentic. They're the genuine article, shortened sometimes for comprehension and space. But apart from that, they're the real words of the time, and there's no fiction in the book. Contrasted with this kind of slightly dreamlike quality. This is an illustration showing one of the many, many, many scrapes with death that Paine had. His ideas and his involvement with history are absolutely fascinating, but just as a kind of personal drama, his life was extraordinary. The number of times he came so close to death and just got away with it is to me part of what makes it a really interesting story to tell, and a really interesting story to narrate as well. This is what should have been a fairly innocuous journey from America to France to try and collect supplies for the American War of Independence, in which the boat ended up in this storm, surrounded by all these gigantic icebergs in the middle of the night, and the boat was nearly perished. It was one of those ones where Paine, like another bottleneck, where his life was hanging by a thread and he didn't die. The guys on the boats were having to push back against the icebergs with great big sticks, because like the main, sorry about that, the main mast had broken on the vessel. So yeah, just an incredible story to tell in terms of drama and visuals. Right, so a little potted history of Paine. He came from an absolutely obscure background. He was born in Thetford in Norfolk, where I've just come back from. His dad was a Quaker, but he was one of those Quakers who was kind of kicked out of the church because he married somebody who wasn't a Quaker. Paine's mother was, I think she was Church of England, can't quite remember. But yeah, he's kind of brought up in the Quaker tradition. And his dad was a stay maker, which basically means making women's corsets, which the cartoonists of the era had an absolute field day with when they wanted to mock Paine. But yeah, and a completely mundane, boring, working class upbringing in Norfolk. And like a lot of young men, he decided early in his life, he'd already shown some hints of not having any sympathy for Christianity very early in his life. He talks about some of the sermons he heard and how ridiculous he thought they were and how cruel he thought they were. But yeah, he became sick of small town life and left home as a teenager and fled to London, and decided, we did a little bit more work as making corsets in London, but he decided to run away to sea. He decided to become a pirate, or what at the time was called a privateer. Now, England at the time was at war with France, and you could get a certificate from the government to say, well, you're allowed to be a pirate. We're going to, this kind of pirating is okay, as long as you go out there, raid French vessels and bring back booty for the government, then that's the kind of pirate we get along with, So Paine thought, yeah, okay, an adventure at sea. He'd his headmaster at school, one of his teachers at school, had filled his head with thrilling stories of ripping yarns on the ocean. So he tries to run away as a pirate in London and tries to sign up with a vessel called the Terrible. Okay, I'm not making this up. This is all absolutely true. The ship is called the Terrible. It's moored at Execution Dock in London. The captain is called Captain Death, and the surgeon is called Mr. Ghost. So, lots of positive signs going on there. And as the advert said, every encouragement will be offered to those who come on board the said vessel to cruise against the French. Paine nearly gets on this boat. I don't know if you can see the cursor here, but his dad actually caught up with him in London and said, come on, son, this is not a good idea. Don't get on this boat. Partly because of his father's Quaker principles, even though he wasn't necessarily a fully participating member of the church, he still had absorbed a lot of its morality. And yeah, Paine didn't get on this boat, which is just as well, because the crew was slaughtered. They had an encounter with a French naval vessel, and yeah, almost all the crew died, and died quite horribly as well, being thrown over the side of the boat while still barely alive. So that was one of his first crazy scrapes with death. He then went on another vessel. He sort of said my father's advice wore off after a while, and he did actually successfully go out on a privateer vessel and earn a bit of money from that, and ends up staying in London for a while, which is when he becomes really interested in science and all the new learning of the Enlightenment that's circulating at the time. He becomes fascinated with science and with astronomy, and I think you probably heard a hint of that in his dialogues earlier about why he believed in God. And just an image trying to sort of sum that up, really, his absolutely adoration of the world around him and his concern for it. And yeah, what a pleasure to draw one of these beautiful, beautiful objects from the time. I mean, this is the virtual reality of its day, isn't it? The wind-up virtual reality, a little model of the solar system and the Earth and the Sun and the Moon. So yeah, he becomes fascinated by science. and then meets Benjamin Franklin in London. This is before the American War of Independence. This is when America is still a colony of Britain. He meets Franklin. Paine's by now had 2 failed marriages. He also became an excise man, which is kind of a tax collector, tax inspector. He ran a small tobacco business in the town of Lewes, just between London and Brighton. But none of those things really sort of worked out for him, and he led an undistinguished life in England until he meets Benjamin Franklin, who recommends to him that he goes to the colonies, to America, to try his talents and his luck over there, which is what he does, and which is when his life just explodes into this amazing drama, this amazing global drama. He arrives in America, and tensions with England are growing more and more and more. He gets work on a local magazine. Not having particularly written anything before, he manages to persuade the editor of this newspaper to give him a job. He starts writing against the slave trade almost immediately. He's one of the very, very early high-profile critics of it. And watching the situation deteriorate with England, and watching people become more and more unhappy about being ruled by King George III, Paine writes a short tract called Common Sense. So yeah, he publishes Common Sense, publishes it in Philadelphia. At the time, people like George Washington, people like Thomas Jefferson, this turning point, Benjamin Franklin, weren't calling for independence. You know, there was this sense that they still wanted to be Englishmen. They still wanted to have natural English rights, and they felt that the difficult relationship they were having with England could be resolved like a family dispute, if you like. Paine's book arrives on the scene and just changes everybody's minds almost overnight. It's the publication that sparks the American Revolution, which just makes it all the more insane that he is not a figure in popular history. We might know who he is, but most people in the street won't. He changed the course of American democracy, and therefore the course of democracy across the world. Common Sense was, if you adjust for inflation and you adjust for the population size of the period, was one of the top 10 best-selling books ever. Bible, Shakespeare, Paine. And that's true of almost all of his books. They were all just absolute, including fiction. You know, they are some of the world's best-selling books, and yet very, very few people know about them. He really has been erased from popular history, which we'll come back to in a bit. So yeah, there he is. He's instrumental in the American War of Independence, and of course, in that process, he has to come up against, I think, what is a form of religious fundamentalism, which is the divine right of kings, the idea that the king is appointed by God. So how dare you suggest that he shouldn't be in charge? Paine began mercilessly mocking royalty. He began calling George III his majesty, which is pretty cruel, given that George III was having some psychological problems at the time, as I'm sure everybody knows. He just was merciless in how he talked about royalty and how absurd and irrational it was. So, you know, your rationalist man Paine is really, really coming out in that process. One of the best quotes I think Paine made about royalty is saying that even nature disapproves of royalty. Because if nature approved of royalty or approves of royalty, why does it keep giving us an ass instead of a lion? Which is just an incredibly derogatory thing to say about the royal family, and was really good fun to illustrate. I hope you can sort of see there's the sort of flip side to royalty in here is an ass, and I've portrayed Paine as the kind of as the court jester allowed to get away with saying what he wants. So really, really, a lot of very powerful things that he's saying and mocking the whole British institution and arguing in favour of ordinary people having the vote, which was a completely new idea at the time. Yeah, extraordinary. So he was one of the first people to really advocate for full democracy for all the country's citizens, and believed it was the best way as well. He believed that the ordinary people were wise, and the ordinary people knew how to make the best decisions for themselves. So really, really ahead of his time in terms of politics and in terms of opposition to monarchy and being pro-Republican. So yeah, he wrote other stuff during the American Civil War. He wrote a tract called The American Crisis, which is perhaps one of his most famous works. It begins, "These are the times that try men's souls," and talks about how it's very, very easy to be a patriot during the summer, but it's really, really difficult to see it through during the winter. He wrote this in this horrible freezing conditions that Washington's degraded army had to face. It's easy to forget just how appalling conditions were in America and just how poor and ill-equipped Washington's army was. It was a classic ragtag militia, fighting against the best trained troops in the world. They're fighting against one of the most powerful regimes there were, and they won. And Paine's speech, "These are the times that try men's souls," was actually read out to all the troops before they crossed the River Delaware. And it's said that it's one of the things that really turned things for the revolution and really, really swept away a lot of the demoralization that was going on. So yeah, an absolute hero of the American Revolution. Yet, he's not on any of the banknotes. He's not celebrated in the way that the other American founding fathers are. He may even have had a hand in the Declaration of Independence. A lot of people have said a lot of it feels like Paine's ideas. And this was kind of fun one to illustrate. As you can see, I've shown Paine up on Mount Rushmore, which is where I think he deserves to be. And I've replaced Teddy Roosevelt with Paine because I thought Roosevelt called him a filthy little atheist. Well, let's get some delayed revenge. Let's get some delayed revenge visually. That it's actually Roosevelt that he's replaced here on Mount Rushmore. So that's Paine's story in America. Yeah, but being committed to democracy and having so slandered the king, this was the first wave of hatred that he faced. The royalists and those who were loyal to the church and to the crown, the Church and King Brigade, absolutely hated Paine. They instantly began producing propaganda against him. There was a wave of effigy burnings that swept up and down the UK in a period shortly after he published a book called Rights of Man, which is continuing his ideas about what is an acceptable way to organize society. Is royalty a good way to run the world? And of course, his conclusion was no. And yeah, he became a target of intense vilification up and down the country. I can almost guarantee you that one of these Paine effigies will have been burnt in Leicester. There were several in Manchester, my hometown, one on Deansgate, which I've tried to portray here. Basically, the state would organize these substitute Guy Fawkes events where the effigy was Paine. And they would pay people to do this, to either burn an effigy or shoot at an effigy. The local factory owners would give people some time off to attend these things. The church often put up money to have this done because, as I say, the church was quite invested in the idea of royalty and the divine right of kings. Yeah, absolutely extraordinary events. But you hear all these accounts of what took place at the time. Some of them really are so telling of the mentality of the period. For instance, one account sort of says the lower orders of people were lined up at the window, and everyone was given a penny loaf and a piece of bully beef to celebrate the burning of the effigy of Paine. And a barrel of beer was given on the occasion. But then you have other people saying, well, yeah, great, but like when the crowd got drunk, quite a lot of them started chanting, long live Tom Paine forever. So people did find ways of subverting these events. And given that you could be arrested for selling Paine's books or talking about him, because it was seditious libel, sometimes this was one of the few ways that people could do anything in public that celebrated Paine's importance and legacy. There's another beautiful account of a small village where the local rector paid a gang of what I assume were locals to burn an effigy of Paine for a guinea. Yeah. But some quite sharp-minded local sympathizer with Paine got hold of the same people and sort of said, if I give you 2 guineas, will you burn the jolly rector in effigy? And they did that. They said, yeah, okay, go on, and we'll burn him as well. So, you know, you can't necessarily assume that the ordinary working class people of Britain were going along with this wave of hatred, even if they turned up to the events themselves and participated. Sometimes it was the only way to talk about Paine and get his name out there. So yeah, fascinating. All kinds of things about class conflicts and conflicts with the church going on there. Paine, being the democratic revolutionary that he was, took a great interest in what around the same time was happening in France. So we have the early stages of the French Revolution going on at the same time that these effigies are being burnt, and Paine starts taking a great interest in this and writes his book, The Rights of Man, in response to the criticisms that are doing the rounds about the French Revolution. And he actually gets invited to come and be a member of the French government. Just off the top of their hat, the revolutionaries sort of say, "We love your work. We know who you are. We know you really believe in freedom from royalty. Come on over and be one of our delegates to the French Assembly." Paine now gets wind of the fact that he's about to be tried for seditious libel in England, and the sentence for that is death. So he decides it's probably a good idea to be a member of the French government. I'll get on over there. Apparently William Blake actually warned him at the end of a meeting one day and said, just look, don't go home tonight or you're a dead man. Go to France, take up your position early, get out of the country, you're in danger. So yeah, Paine ends up in revolutionary France, which is an absolutely insane place to be. A very, very different experience to the American Revolution, in that it so quickly starts descending into the terror. Paine gets some direct experience of this in the streets of Paris, where he'd forgotten to wear his cockade in his hat, you know, the revolutionary symbol, the sort of the red, white and blue circles, like a, what do you call those things that politicians wear? A rosette that you wore in your hat, a revolutionary symbol. He forgot to wear his one day and was nearly lynched by a mob in the street who started shouting out that he was an aristocrat. And the phrase at the time was "à la lanterne," "à la lanterne." In other words, hang somebody from a lamppost, which was a very brutal way to go, because you'd then be eviscerated and your head stuck on a pike and displayed through the streets. Things started to get really, really vicious very, very early on in the French Revolution. And this is one of the first conflicts Paine has with fundamentalism, with political fundamentalism. Once the revolutionary government in France gets into a position of power and they have the king arrested, and this is obviously a very simple version of the story, but they have the king arrested, they want to send him to the guillotine. And Paine is one of the few people who stands up against this and says, no, if we're going to begin this revolution, let's not begin it by shedding blood, which meant that people like Robespierre and Marat started to really hate him. They really, really disliked him for doing this. And they nearly lost the vote as well as to whether the king should be executed or not. And from there on in, Paine was basically on Robespierre's death list. And as the French Revolution, which is just a fascinating part of the story, becomes more and more and more militant, they start becoming more and more obsessed with virtue, with the whole idea of who's on side and who isn't, and this decreasing narrow number of people who can be counted on. The slightest kind of dissent starts to become this massive crime for which you can go to the guillotine. And actually, during the start of the Terror, there was actually an eclipse in Paris, a full solar eclipse, which I've illustrated here, on the same day that one of the crazed revolutionaries declares, "Let terror be the order of the day." The sun then covers the moon, then covers the sun, and it's a really, really dark moment. So simply, despite his texts being, his book Rights of Man being one of the things that really helped galvanize the French Revolution, Paine's arrested. Paine's arrested on basically on the grounds that he's a foreigner, and he's sent to Luxembourg prison, which is this bizarre luxury palace hotel that's being rapidly converted into a prison. And yet another one of his insane scrapes with death. Everybody's locked up in this prison. And the way the process works to take you to the guillotine the next day is during the night, the warder will come along with a piece of chalk and mark the door of your cell with an X. Yeah? And Paine has developed a fever. He's begun, in prison, he's begun writing his perhaps most contentious book, which is called The Age of Reason, which we'll come on to in a minute. But he gets this fever and comes very, very close to death, which is what some of the sort of more hallucinatory images I showed you of the universe are illustrating in the story. And they allow him to have the door of his prison cell open. But it's one of those doors that opens 180 degrees and swings all the way out and ends up lying flat against the external wall of the cell. And so the jailer, knowingly or not, we don't know, marks the door with an X, such that when the door's shut again, the X is on the inside of the cell. And that night, they come to collect everybody for the guillotine the next day. And it's the only reason Paine escaped going to the guillotine. We nearly lost him yet again, we nearly lost this amazing figure. And I hope you can all see the hidden kind of image in the grain of the door. A bit like the iceberg I showed you earlier. It's my way visually of sort of saying death haunted him all the way through his life. So yeah, one more scrape with death, and he gets to publish his most infamous work, The Age of Reason, which is his book that's primarily about religion, is the one that I hope is of great interest to yourselves in the audience today. So what was Paine's actual point of view about religion? Okay, so he, as you have heard from those quotes, loathed established religion, but he was actually a deist. He was somebody who did believe there was a God, and believed very, very firmly, a bit like a lot of pre-Darwinian biologists believed in God through the mechanism of Paley's watch. The idea of, the complexity of nature is one of the things that tells you there's a God, because it looks like it's been designed. Paine's version of that, and obviously Paine being from the pre-Darwinian period, was that astronomy and the heavens and the whole of creation is an unadulterated revelation from God. He, I spoke earlier about his really deep love of astronomy. That's what motivated him to think that there was a deity. What he objected to as a deist was the idea of revelation, and it's what he wrote about in The Age of Reason in quite an angry, mocking, acerbic, and very, very logical way. That all of the mainstream religions are based on one person's claim that God revealed himself or God spoke to them, and that there's this magic mechanism that gets beamed into one person's head, in the case of Muhammad, who wrote the whole thing out, or is alleged to have written the whole thing out, or like the Bible is supposed to be, inspired. But the Paine argued that the only evidence we've got for that is those people telling us that they were inspired. And he said that for him, the infallible proof of God is actually in the heavens, that speaks to absolutely everybody. Now, this is not something I believe myself. I'm a quite militant atheist, but it's a really interesting position that if you take the human middleman or agency out of, and it becomes an extremely interesting part of his life in that the arguments are so familiar. He showed an initial draft of The Age of Reason to Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin's response really surprised me. It's one of the letters that we still have, one of the correspondences that's gone in the book, where he sort of says to him, look, I don't necessarily strongly believe this, but people are quite wicked even with religion, aren't they? So, like, people are going to be even worse without it. And so I suggest you burn this book and don't unchain the tiger. I think it's fascinating that people were using arguments like that way back when to try and counter any kind of arguments that, well, no, religion is fundamentally flawed. Christianity and the Quran and so on and so forth. They don't make any logical sense, and there's no real evidence for them. And it's just human interpretation. And these arguments are still being played out today. It's fascinating that Paine provoked those kind of reactions really, really early on. The Age of Reason produced yet another wave of vilification against him. He was already hated for his position against royalty and so on and so forth. But things really, really intensified. Lots of people that we think of as respectable and heroic figures, from history, like Wilberforce, the anti-slave trade campaigner, he condemned Paine, and he led a prosecution against Paine. Now, obviously, Paine was no longer in England, so couldn't be prosecuted, couldn't be actually punished. But they began a prosecution against him for now what's it called? Blasphemous libel. So the original accusation was seditious libel because he didn't like the king, and now it's blasphemous libel, for which there is the potential death penalty. And the weird thing is, the guy who defended Thomas Paine for rights of man, a guy called Erskine, one of the sort of celebrity lawyers of the day, now decides to prosecute him. And the government can't get hold of Paine and can't get their hands around his neck, so they start arresting booksellers. And the guy who gets taken to court for this is somebody who sold one copy of The Age of Reason. It became such a contentious book that they decided to go ahead and take this guy to trial and sent him to prison for hard labor. And he was not a robust man, this bookseller. So yeah, it went absolutely bonkers in terms of the persecution, but also like just all the propaganda and vilification. Biographies that suggested that when he was a young man, he used to have sex with his cat. I mean, it got that bad. You think social media is bad? It was just insane, some of the things that were said about him, and some of the figures that you would otherwise perhaps admire in terms of their social and political standing joined in with this. And it became incredibly painful for Thomas Paine, because loads of his friends abandoned him. People who'd known him during the American Revolution, who'd regarded him as a hero, no longer wanted to talk to him. People would cross the street rather than meet with him. One of the few people who actually stuck with him was Thomas Jefferson, to his massive credit. As Jefferson's just become president, Paine arrives back from France, having been released from jail after Robespierre and that lot fell. Jefferson's one of the few people who's been, willing to seen in public with him, which cost him a lot as president, because it was easy for people to use Paine's reputation as this satanic, this advocate of the devil. It could be really used as propaganda against you. So credit to Jefferson for sticking with him, but loads of other people didn't, and Paine became more and more isolated. Some really difficult end to the book. He ended up lodging in these kind of cheap lodging places. There's a lot of evidence that he may have started drinking inappropriately. A lot of people dispute that. It's one of the sequences in the book where you're going to have to make up your own mind based on the words from the time. But yeah, he became more and more isolated, and it was quite often like working class immigrants to America who knew of his work, who would stick with him in the pub and be his mate. But the high and mighty quite often didn't want anything to do with him. And so, yeah, towards the end of his life, he ends up in this house, this lodging house, where there was a kind of care home network in the period where you would be a lodger at somebody's house, and it was basically nursing care as you got more and more ill. A lot of Paine's symptoms, some of them may have been to do with drinking. A lot of them will have been to do with the time he spent in the Luxembourg prison, in Robespierre's jail. He ends up surrounded by these religious fanatics who come and knock on his door and want to obtain his deathbed confession. These people turning up announcing that they're here from God to save him. Even though he's already religious, they're absolutely insisting he accepts Christianity. And there's an incredible last moment in his life where his housekeeper and even his doctor are saying, now's the time to turn to Jesus. Classic story that Christopher Hitchens talked about quite a lot. The people trying to extort confessions from frail people who are in a lot of physical pain in the era before anesthetics. In the last hours of Paine's life, his doctor is leaning over him like a vampire, saying, I really don't think you've got 12 hours to live. Why do you keep crying out, oh God, which is such a cruel thing to do to somebody. It's obvious why the guy is crying out, oh God, it's what you do when you're in pain. And he says to him, this is very odd, given that you're the author of The Age of Reason. Why are you saying, oh God, yeah? I want a confession from your dying lips that you accept Jesus as your savior. And bless him, Thomas Paine's last words were, I have no need to believe on that. And then he died, which I think is a brilliant, defiant last moment from a person who really does need to be recognized as a cultural and a political hero. And that begs the final question I was going to ask, and I'd be, really interested to know. Oh no, I've nearly forgotten. Sorry, I've nearly forgotten Tom Paine's afterlife. Oh, here he is on his deathbed with his final words. I have no wish to believe on that subject. Even after he died, right, his life continued to be extraordinary. He was buried on his farm near New York. Yeah? The Quakers wouldn't accept him in their graveyard because they thought it would become this kind of pilgrimage place for all his political fans. So he's buried in America. And this slightly deranged English radical called William Cobbett, who was one of Paine's most vociferous critics early in life, but then changed his mind and became a Paine fan, decides, Cobbett's English, by the way, he's an English radical, he decides to go over to America and dig Paine's remains up and bring them back to England and give them a proper burial in this magnificent shrine. And the first place he's going to bring those remains is Manchester, my hometown. But this is shortly after the Peterloo Massacre. It's the same year as the Peterloo Massacre, about 2 months later, that Cobbett tries to bring Paine's remains back into the town. And a line of troops stops him at a bridge in Salford and says, this isn't going to happen. As a result, Paine's bones end up down in London, and they become lost, and that's the title of the book. That almost like religious icons, his bones were dug up, but then disappeared, which is a really, really strange thing to happen to anybody. So yeah, his bones disappeared, and so did his memory. And I think that is partly because of the age of reason. I think Paine paid a great price, and he was warned that this is what would happen. One of Washington's friends sort of said to him, like, people are going to forget all the things you achieved with your political writings. If you slander God in public, you're going to be forgotten. And that seems to me to be true. So what a strange experience to happen to a guy who's actually a religious man, but criticizing mainstream religion means that he's been eradicated from popular history. And I really, really hope the book is going to be part of restoring him to the place that he deserves. And I think I'll probably stop there. I hope I haven't gone on for too long. I've totally lost track of time. And yeah, would love to hear any questions you've got. If our chair will facilitate that, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Well, thanks very much, Paul, for those illuminating words and illuminating pictures too. They're very impressive. So I think wishing to ask a question, Steve Roman, then yes, go ahead.
Hello, Paul.
Steve. How you doing? All right.
I'm fine, thanks. I'm glad I could join you from Manchester as well, and it's fascinating. Starting right at the end, I read today in the annotated diaries of Absalom Watkin that Paine's bones were bequeathed to Cobbett's son when he died. So presumably they were still in existence somewhere in 1835 when Cobbett died.
There are all sorts of claims. There are all sorts of claims. His skull is meant to be in Australia, and this antique relics dealer claims that he has the real thing. I have no idea whether there's been any proof provided other than the fact that it says Thomas Paine across the top of the skull. Possibly could be faked. I think what's interesting is Paine would have loathed that. He would have loathed this thing of relics, like being somebody who didn't believe in religion and saints what do you call it, saints' thumbs and bones and all this kind of thing. I think he would have been disgusted by it. But there's one very amusing story, because nobody really knows exactly where they went. There's one really amusing story that I think it's Conway, the biographer of Paine, who was told in his youth that Tom Paine was so evil that he couldn't be buried. His bones ended up going to a button manufacturer, and got turned into buttons, and he's now traveling the world as buttons. I really like that one, because as Conway goes on to say, well, that's a bit like his ideas. His ideas are spreading around the world, and it's actually quite a beautiful metaphor that I've had real fun illustrating in the book. So yeah, who knows where they ended up, and sod Cobbett for doing it. I think it's a really disrespectful thing to do, and then to fail to put together this enormous monument, which was supposed to be crowdfunded, the crowdfunding of its day, and it all just fell through. Cobbett was weird. Cobbett was an odd man, a very odd man.
Thank you.
John Katz has got a question. John.
Good evening from Secular Hall.
I so wish I was there. I so wish I was there.
Anyway, first a point. You referred to Quaker churches. If Quakers had blasphemy, that would be blasphemy. They're steeple haters. The last thing that they ever wanted is a church. They do have meeting houses, but
yes, you've slip of the tongue. Slip of the tongue. I apologise. Slip of the tongue.
The other thing was, I just wondered if you'd like to comment on how influential Quaker thinking may have been on Paine. For example, Fox believed that there was God within everyone, and the Quakers were well known for being prosecuted because they refused to doff hats to royalty and aristocracy, etc., and believed in full equality. And Paine's father was a Quaker, and he was involved, I think, quite a lot with the Quakers in Lewis, and I believe also in the States. Of course, William Penn had founded Pennsylvania with a lot of Quaker thinking going into its constitution, which in turn affected the thinking behind that of the US. So I wonder if you'd like to comment.
Yeah, he had he had a really mixed relationship with the Quakers, as did his dad. I mean, as I say, his Paine often referred to his dad as having Quaker morality, but his dad was kicked out of the movement, as a result of marrying outside of it. When the American Revolutionary War starts, Paine says, "Well, look, I'm only a Quaker in that if everybody wants to lay down their arms, then fine. But we don't live in a world of angels, and God is not going to come and protect us. And so, I'm pleased to have a gun, and I'm pleased that God has put a gun in my hands." So, like the fact that he wanted to be buried in the Quaker grounds near his farm is an interesting one. But again, that was rejected. His involvement with Quakerism was also used against him, but not necessarily by the right wing. People in the French Revolution, people like Marat, said that Paine's point of view that we shouldn't execute the king is invalid because he's biased by his Quaker beliefs. So, he had a complex relationship with the religion, but it was also used as propaganda against.
I'll try again, saying that thank you for your presentation tonight. It was really good. And Frank and I first saw a presentation from you when you spoke during lockdown last year from the Working Class Movement Library.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And it just can't help thinking that if Paine were to come back now and see what's happening, he just would be so devastated. I mean, he'd find it worse than all of us because he'd gone through so much before and tried to make people more aware.
Specifically, what things do you think he would object to?
Well, today's political corruption, not that that hasn't always gone on. Counterculture, no platforming, fundamentalism, it just goes on and on, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean,
in our enlightened age.
It's interesting with democracy, though, because like the whole sort of anti-elitism, I presume you're kind of thinking of what happened with Trump, aren't you, and the moves against democracy in America. Paine was actually quite naive about democracy. He didn't actually believe that there should be any checks and balances. And people who were his fans, who very much liked his book, Common Sense, including one of the American presidents, John Adams, he said that Paine was way too democratical, that Paine thought that direct democracy without any kind of controls on it was the way to run things. So without Congress balancing out the other houses and without bicameral systems. So you could argue Paine was quite naive and would maybe get a quite educative shock to see what untrammeled democracy can be like and the way it can slip into mob rule. I don't know what you'd think about the current religious situation. Would all of the founding fathers be shocked to see that fundamentalism is still such a part of American life? Would they be shocked that it's almost impossible to get elected as president unless you declare your religious belief? And above all, what would Paine make of atheism? Because one of the things I didn't touch on, because there was just so little time in the talk, is that Paine actually disliked atheism. He might be quite shocked by the atheist movement. He is one of the things that really concerned him about the progress of the French Revolution. He felt that they were taking things in a godless direction, and he did associate God with morality. So yeah, a complex figure. But one of the questions I always try and ask at the end of these is, if we're going to bring Paine, if we're going to stick him in the TARDIS and bring him here, what would he make of Darwinism, and would that have impacted on him in terms of would it have corroded his belief? I don't know. I mean, he tended not to talk about biology as proof of. I don't know if there's one. Yeah, no, that's gone now. That's great. Somebody's asked on the comments. Can I ask what the connection was with Darby and Thomas Wright? So Joseph Wright, that's not the same guy. Thomas Wright is a quite obscure astronomer from the period. I don't think it's the same guy. In fact, it's not the same guy. Joseph Wright he's the bloke who painted the glowing model of the solar system, wasn't it? All those people gathered around like a brass model. No, there's no connection between them. But Wright is another kind of obscure figure that I only found out about through Carl Sagan. And Thomas Wright of Derby, he's the guy who he first published a book showing the actual size of the universe. He actually did these diagrams that made it clear to people just how small the Earth was, and so on and so forth. And Paine never met him or anything like that, but I bet would have known of his work. And I just thought it was interesting that this was an age of a breakdown of strict social class. There was a lot of social mobility going on, a lot of working class men mostly making their way through the system in a way that they could never have done in the past. So they're kind of linked in that way, but they also seem to have similar ideas about a sort of a kind of conscious, caring, deistic universe that I thought was fascinating. It's also just a brilliant drawing. I mean, what a great drawing that was. I've just copied it. All these eyes staring.
Nate, you've got a question?
Muted. Yeah, I'm very pleased to have a bust of Tom Paine on the front of the Secular Hall in Leicester, which is the first public sculpture of him in Britain. I'm just going to say about history. We have a well-known.
Wait, can I stop you there? Can I just stop you and ask you a question? Are you saying that was the first ever public statue of Paine? That one?
Yes.
Wow, really? Okay, I didn't know that.
1881.
Okay.
If you can find an earlier one, because I think the one in Thetford came later.
Yeah, no, it did, yeah.
And I think the sculptor who did it had been making busts of him for some time. I mean, I'm just trying to remember his name now, but he was making busts of people in the 1860s. So I think it's one, he made plaster busts on order, and he did all the known, he had a whole library of them. So yeah, that's first one. But I mean, what's interesting in Leicester, we have a figure called Daniel Lambert, who other people from Leicester will know about him. And he's celebrated for being fat, but he was also a jailer. And the man he jailed in 1793 was a man called Richard Phillips, who was jailed for selling a copy of Thomas Paine. Now, we don't remember Richard Phillips, but we remember the fat man who jailed him and who celebrated for being obese. Whereas the radical who was put in prison, and also another man who committed suicide as a result of being sacked for having a leaflet which was about, I think, about Tom Paine, or certainly about democracy. We don't remember him, a man called Hartley. So it bears out what you were talking about in the way in which attempts have been made to erase Tom Paine from history. It also applies even at a local level.
Sure. I mean, it's interesting, the whole thing about like getting access to Paine's books. There was almost like an underground railway of his books. And Paine was extremely interested in publishing them as cheap as possible. He made very, very, very little money from publishing his works. He said, I'm a farmer of ideas, and the crops I grow, I give away, But yeah, he deliberately produced these as cheap as possible editions to get them out to the working class, get them into mines, get them into cottages. And this was driving people like Wilberforce and Hannah More, who we think of as ethical figures when they weren't really, apart from that one thing about the slave trade. It was driving them crazy. There was this wave of a bit like the McCarthyist Red Scare. There was just this wave of fear. you know, the Paine's works were undermining society. And they probably were, you know, they probably were. I'm just having a little look. We've got some more comments in the thing. Trevor Griffiths and Richard Attenborough wanted to make a film. Yeah, absolutely amazing that never happened. What a great shame. It could have made an enormous difference to Paine's reputation, and maybe will happen still. Who knows? It seems to me with some of the CGI stuff you can do now with historical epics, you could make an extraordinary drama of Paine's life, and I hope the graphic novel might even put that idea in someone's head, you know, and make sure it happens. Yeah, and somebody else saying that they found deism through Tom Paine, and it's important to get to deism. Oh, it's jumping up. It's important to get deism to get a lot of the Age of Reason. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I was going to sort of say is I'm a militant atheist, but I actually found myself quite sympathizing with Paine's religious views. I find them the least objectionable of the different religious views that there are, partly because I share I share that sort of Saganite sense of how wonderful the universe is, and I understand that people find it what's called a numinous or kind of uplifting or transcendental experience to contemplate the beauty and size of the galaxy. So I kind of sympathize with that a bit. And given that religion is one of the most polarizing things there is, I wonder if it might be possible to get deism as a safe haven for people who cannot quite shake off religion, but manage to shake off fundamentalism. I wonder if it would be an interesting place that people could go, you know, because if we're not going to eliminate religion completely, that's just not going to happen. I think that's become very, very clear over the last couple of 100 years. So yeah, perhaps a deism revival would be a good thing.
Questions. So is it? So I'll conclude by thanking Paul for his excellent talk and excellent illustrations, and we'll look forward to the book appearing, and also the recording, which I'm about to end. I'll pass over to him to decide what he wants to do with it, and perhaps he'll pass the word around more generally, and people elsewhere who've missed the session this evening want to still to see it at their leisure. Okay, so thanks very much, Paul, and we'll see us tackling you. You're muted.
And I haven't said thank you very much for inviting me, and
Yeah.
I hope I'll do a book launch tour around the UK and hopefully catch